Welcome to our second speaker event for this season. This is Professor Craig Gundersen, who is the Soybean Endowed Professor of Economics and Strategy. You didn't know that existed, did you? The Soybean Endowed Professor of Economics and Strategy at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. Craig is a leader in the topic which he will address today, which is food insecurity in the United States in both scientific journals and in public policy formation. Welcome, Craig.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So I was really happy when Steve contacted me to present up here, because, as you know, I'm up here for a meeting, APAM, and I've known Steve for a long time, but I've known his brother for even longer. Steve's brother, Jim Ziliak, some of you may have heard him. He's anyway, he and I have co-authored together quite a bit, and he was, I guess he's not coming up until tomorrow, so unfortunately he can't join us, so you get me instead of him, but thank you, Steve, for inviting me. I really do appreciate this opportunity. I don't know how this is usually structured, but please interrupt me at any point throughout the presentation, okay? So that's the way that I'd rather have it. The other thing is I guess we get done at 5:45, correct? Okay, so I will plan on that. Does anybody have to leave earlier? Is 5:45 fine with everybody?
Some will stay because they have a class at 6.
Oh, you do? Okay, some of you got a class at 6, okay. What class do you have at 6? Oh, it's what? Oh, macroeconomic theory, okay.
Taught by Professor Langer.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so what I'm going to be, so I'm going to structure this over a few things. First, I'm going to talk about how we measure food insecurity in the United States, okay? So the way we measure in the United States may be different than if we measure to, say, in low-income countries. So I'll be concentrating on food insecurity in the United States because of the title. Then I'll turn to some what food insecurity looks like in the United States across different dimensions, including the determinants of food insecurity. And then I will turn to a discussion of the health consequences associated with food insecurity, and then what we can do to alleviate food insecurity. And most of that discussion will be around SNAP, which formerly known as the Food Stamp Program, which is colloquially known in Illinois as LINK. Okay, so whenever we're going to study something, you should probably say, why is it even worth looking at something? The first reason is that there's serious consequences associated with food insecurity. First, we can even just see this in its own right, okay? So for example, is that if we may think it's wrong that children don't know where their next meal is coming from. We may think it's wrong when seniors go to bed hungry, okay? We may think that that's. I've given this presentation enough times to different groups, and I've actually had people say to me, hunger is a great motivator. And the person presumably was never hungry, but so for them at least, I will say to them is that, well, yes, that I disagree with that perspective, but we also have to recognize that there's negative health outcomes associated with food insecurity. And later in the presentation, I'll be going over a whole array of those. So even if one doesn't care about hunger in and of itself, one may be concerned about the negative health outcomes associated with it. Now, the next point is that if all poor people in the United States were food insecure, and all non-poor people in the United States were food secure, to some extent, there's no reason to even measure food insecurity, okay? It costs a lot of money to measure this outcome. But what we find in the United States is actually 60% of poor households are food secure. So despite relatively serious constraints on their ability to purchase food, is there still food secure? On the other hand, about 10 to 15% of households with incomes above the poverty line are food insecure. Okay? So it's not completely characterized by income. In other words, we need to measure this separately than we do, say, poverty. The final reason is that really the central goal of the U.S. Department of Agriculture is to alleviate food insecurity. Okay? This manifests itself over a few different dimensions. The first is that about 75% of the USDA's budget is spent on food assistance programs. And these food assistance programs, in the main, have the central goal of alleviating food insecurity. Okay? And I would even make the argument that even like the farm support programs, which constitute another 25%, and some of those other efforts, really are at base food security. In other words, it's enabling farmers. We can have a discussion about whether or not it's an effective way to whether or not we should have crop insurance subsidy programs and things like that, but just abstracting away from that, the justification that's given for why we have those programs is in the main along food security grounds. Okay. Prior to 1996, despite this being the central of the USDA, there was no real measurement of it. So we didn't know how good programs were doing or how poorly they were doing. So this really was the main reason we began to measure this, is to be able to look at this specific issue. Okay. So this gives you some context why I think it's an important thing, you know, worth examining in the U.S. context. Now, something I always talk a little bit about here then is that given that some of you may be interested in food security issues in a global context, I mean, it depends on the audience I'm talking to, but for those of you interested in that, is I'm not going to make the claim that there's any sort of equivalency between food insecurity in the United States and food insecurity, say, in Burkina Faso, okay? Is that in those countries when people experience food insecurity, many of them die, okay? And many of them suffer lifelong consequences from being food insecure, okay? Currently in the United States, that's not happening, okay? So I don't want to draw some equivalence. And moreover, the number of people in the United States who are food insecure is quite a bit, is lower than it would be in other countries. However, part of the reason why I think this is incumbent upon us is, you know, if we said to India or Burkina Faso or Malawi or some other country, tomorrow you have to end food insecurity in your country, they're like, well, that's impossible. I mean, and they would be right. They'd be absolutely right to say we cannot end food insecurity in our country tomorrow. The United States is different, though, is that we can end it. So it's a very different situation. So whenever you're able to say, yes, we can end something, and this is something that we can do here. So give you a bit of background for why we look at food insecurity. And there's 18 questions on something called the Core Food Security Module, okay? And this has been on surveys in its present form since about 2000. And here are some examples of the questions. The first is, and least severe, is I worried whether our food would run out before we got money to buy more. So some notion about food insecurity is, you know, just being worried about whether or not you can feed your family, okay? The most severe is, did a child in the household ever not eat for a full day because you couldn't afford enough food? Fortunately, in the United States, the final question is not responded affirmatively to that often. Now, in contrast, is these questions, the 18 questions, are actually being used in more and more in low-income countries. And in these low-income countries, is then, of course, you may have a higher proportion of households where a child did not eat for a full day. Now, so this gives you some sense about what the questions are like. And then we put them into these different categories. And what I'm going to be mainly talking about today is the category of food insecurity. Okay? And we say a household is food insecure if they have 3 or more affirmative responses. Now, look, note that that's two things about that. The first thing is that if somebody has 3 or more questions, I didn't list the full 18 here, but if you have 3 or more questions, you at least have some person in the household at some point in the previous year who had to cut back on the amount of food they ate. Okay? So the second point about it is that if you have 1 or 2 affirmative responses, you're considered to be food secure. So in principle, somebody could be worried about whether or not food would run out, and when some of the adults in the household cut the size of their meals, and there's only 2 affirmative responding to affirmatively, that would then be food secure. Okay. So in other words, this is a relatively high hurdle to get over to be counted as food insecure in the United States.
Craig, who developed this module?
So it was developed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, back in 1996. Actually, it was in development before that, and in consultation with like CDC, HHS, and some other things, but USDA has taken responsibility for this module. So this is what food insecurity looks like if we look at it by year. 3 things to emphasize about this. I'll concentrate on the bottom one, which is for all persons. The top one is for children, bottom one is for all persons. So what you see then is that 3 things. First thing is that even during good economic times, like 2000 and 2007 were good economic times in the main United States. What you see is even during good economic times, about 12% of Americans are food insecure. Okay? So this means when we fully recover from economic problems, you're still going to have a lot of people who are food insecure. Second point is that not unexpectedly, there was a huge increase in food insecurity from 2007 to 2008. Okay? So is that, in looking at that bump up, that's a 30% increase. Okay? It's a huge increase. I can't say it's unprecedented because we don't go far enough back in time. Like we don't know what would have happened, see, during the, for those of us who are alive and living in the Midwest at the time, the 1981-82 recession was really bad in the Midwest, at least, especially in around, Chicago, Gary, up to Madison, up to Detroit. So I don't know what it would have looked like then, so I don't know if this is unprecedented or not. The third thing, and this is somewhat of a surprise, is that these rates remain high, okay? Great Recession ended roughly in 2009. However, rates remained high all the way up until 2014. So despite, in a Great Recession, despite unemployment rates, all these other things, is we still had high rates of food insecurity. Okay. So while many people did recover pretty quickly during the Great Recession, a lot of people, the effects lingered for a long time period. And so it's only in 2015 that we see substantial cutbacks. In 2016, we're almost back to where we were in 2007, but still slightly higher. Okay? Yes.
What kind of sample is it, and how many people are in the sample?
Okay, so this is taken from the current population survey. It's a sample of about 60,000 Americans, nationally and state representative,
right,
for about 60,000 60,000 households.
Yeah. So it's an extended form of the CPS.
Right. So what the structure of the CPS is, there's a monthly form that's asked. That's just like the current population survey is used to generate our poverty rates and our unemployment rates and things like that. And the way it's done is people are interviewed for 4 months, they're out for 8 months, back in for 4 months, and for some of the months they have a supplement, and this comes from the December supplement. Yeah.
What is the anomaly for the children ratio around 2010 where it takes that dip and then goes back up? What happened differently?
I don't know what happened there. Now, with apologies to Steve, is that dip was not statistically significant, but it was not. So in other words, yes, there definitely was a dip, but if we had average over a few years, then you would not see that.
It could be that.
Yeah. So.
When you say there were 60,000 people that are surveyed, is that just random?
60,000 households. It's right. It's well.
Or do you is it people that get a certain kind of assistance? Or?
Oh no. It's supposed to be nationally representative in terms of incomes.
It is stratified.
Yeah. It's
a stratified random sample that follows rooftops, so it follows addresses rather than individuals.
Right. So basically, it's they first choose a sample of areas and then within that. So, but it's also state representative. So you're more likely to be interviewed, say, in North Dakota to make it state representative than say in Illinois. But okay, so this gives you some sense about this. Now, this next thing are any of you familiar with Feeding America? Okay, so Feeding America is the umbrella organization for all food banks in the United States. And in Chicago, there's a food bank called the Greater Chicago Food Depository. Maybe some of you have heard of that. At any rate, I'm on the technical advisory group for Feeding America. As part of that is that food banks will oftentimes serve large proportions, like many counties, okay? But they didn't really have any sense about what food insecurity looked like in these other counties. So as part of this, I just developed this thing called Map the Meal Gap. We can go into details about how it's constructed and everything, but for purposes here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it looks like. So what you see then in the, a few things to note about this is, first of all, across the Mississippi Delta, for example, you have really high rates. Across parts of Appalachia, you have really high rates. So you have these pockets of rates. How many of you have been to Memphis? Okay, and Memphis is a great city. I was just down in this area. I was giving a presentation in Little Rock.
Were you dressed like Elvis?
I was not. I was just dressed like an ordinary person. I changed into, but I drove through Memphis, and there was this great restaurant here called Bounty on Broad Street. There's this Broad Street. I don't know if you're. Anyway,
yeah,
it's great. Yeah, and it's great. You should
barbecue.
No. This was just I had this pork shake. It was great. Pork shake with grits. It really was great. So if you're there, but anyway, I was driving through here. So my daughter is a sophomore at University of Alabama, Roll Tide, And then so I went down there for a game. If any of you are college football fans, you really got to make an effort to go see a game at Tuscaloosa. Okay. So this gives you some sense about, now there's other parts of the country where you'll see really relatively low, like upper Midwest is relatively low. With the exception of, you see these pockets of high rates, okay? You might guess what they are, is they're American Indian reservations. American Indians have substantially higher rates of food insecurity than the rest of the country. So like if you look at a state like South Dakota or North Dakota, which in the main have pretty low rates, as you get these things, those are where American Indian reservations, yeah.
Do any of the module questions address what food is? Because it seems to me that eating is very different from being food secure or food insecure.
Right, so there's no sense about like what constitutes a meal.
Yeah.
That's never defined.
Yeah.
Or it's not defined, what constitutes a balanced meal.
Yeah.
It's just, or cutting back on something, right?
Yeah.
The only stipulation there is each of the questions has something about due to economic constraints.
Yeah.
So for example, if somebody's fasting for religious reasons or dieting or something, they would not be considered to be food insecure despite the fact that they're cutting back on their meals.
Yeah.
But other than that, there's really no things. But you may expect that there would be differences across different groups. So for example, at least in some American Indian nations, is that there's this tradition is that you'll always, if somebody comes to your house, you're obliged to feed them.
Yeah.
And therefore you have these different obligations which may not be present in other places.
Right.
And so they may say, I had to cut back on food, but that's because they were feeding other people. You know what I mean? So it's lots of
Sure.
different contexts for
culture.
this.
Yeah,
But we see really high rate, yeah.
It's fascinating actually because isn't nutrition really the main issue here more than availability of food?
Yeah. So at base, the measure of food insecurity, so on the one hand is that we know that those who are food insecure on average have lower nutrient intakes. So for example, Steve's brother Jim and I have an annual report that we put out that looks at food insecurity among seniors in the United States. And we find consistently dramatically lower rates of nutrient intakes for seniors. And that's especially bad for seniors because a lot of seniors are already not getting enough essential nutrients, especially of protein, calcium, these other things. We find that food insecurity, we see that. Now, the one thing is you'll see from the questions is none of them reference, did you have a nutritious meal or anything like that? Because that's difficult to define what constitutes a nutritious versus non-nutritious meal.
Difficult, and yet it's interesting that the poverty line is still measured based on Molly Orshansky's 1955 food budget.
Right, the thrifty food plan.
So in 1955, the federal government did a survey of American diets, and that's what she used, as you know, to create that poverty line.
Right.
So it's the cost of a nutritious days eating multiplied by 3 is that's our current, and that's still our poverty line today.
Right.
Not a very good poverty line.
Right. No, it's not.
Washington.
But even in that context, as you know, is that it was not necessarily a nutritious meal.
Right.
It was just a meal.
It included lard and cod liver oil.
Exactly.
And lots of,
and things.
So it was 1955.
Right. Exactly.
Definition.
Exactly. And so.
But it seems like the USDA ought to take a stronger stand on that.
On that it's.
On defining the nutrition. I mean, Michelle Obama did.
Did she?
Yeah. She inverted the food pyramid.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get. But I mean, USA does do a lot of this. I mean, they do have, they now do the My Meal, My Plate. I think it's called My Plate. Where they have all these different things you're supposed to be eating.
Mm-hmm.
As you might imagine, all these things are very contentious about different groups
Sure.
wanting their stuff in there. Like I do work with the soybean industry, and it's been interesting is that on the one hand, most all soybeans are fed to pigs and chickens. Okay? And so therefore they want to make sure that pork and everything is sure. But there's also the other parts of the soybean industry that want to make sure that meat alternatives are included in this. And so there's like a big debate about it. It's fascinating, these nutrition arguments that come about.
Sure. And sorry, but just one other point. You pointed to the political economy part, which is that the USDA is also has to respond to farmers and who are themselves stakeholders in all of this.
Right.
So my daughter's mantra is don't eat plates that are all brown food, because that usually means fried. Everything's fried, right? And now she learned this by watching her father eat. So I'm just saying. But
Because yours was all fried and stuff?
Yeah, fried fish, French fries.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
Exactly.
So far as I'm concerned.
No, thank you very much.
I mean, is that to some extent it is right. Yeah. I don't want any sort of that on my plate. Well, some red, like if I'm cooking sausages, having some red bell peppers. Put some stuff in it, maybe
That's
some
very
green bell peppers with that, or I had salmon, that salmon dish I was telling you about.
Yeah.
For those of you who haven't, have any of you started doing sous vide way of cooking? I pronounce it
I'm
right.
about to start. Yeah.
It's great. Yes, you do it?
It's fantastic.
It's fantastic. It'll transform the way you cook. I made this salmon dish. You put it in there for 115 degrees. You put it in there for like 45 minutes. You just get this salmon. Because salmon, if it's overcooked, none of this thing's worse than that.
Yeah.
But it's really bad. But just flaky and just wait. You get it. You put some sauce on. You put it in the sous vide, and then you fry it up just for a second, just to get a little bit.
Okay.
But it's great. And I made these pork chops. You really do have to. It'll transform the way you cook. It's just amazing. So there's just a little bit of advice. So this gives you the notion of overall food insecurity rates. This gives a picture of child food insecurity rates, and the way this is defined is that this is the proportion of children that are in food insecure households. Okay. It does not mean that the children themselves are necessarily food insecure. What you see in the United States is that in general is that the parents will protect their children. So you'll hear a lot of stories about you hear these qualitative surveys that say, mother's going without food so the kids can eat enough and things like this, okay? This is different oftentimes than we see in some low-income countries, and for many different reasons is that sometimes the parents will be the first ones to eat, in particular the father, in part because they might, for many different reasons. One might be that he has to have enough calories to be able to work the next day or something like that. It can also be for other reasons, of course. But it's different in the United States is that the kids go without. But however, is that poverty rates amongst households with children are quite a bit higher, and hence why this is quite a bit darker in terms of the pictures in the previous slide. Okay.
It's interesting that North Dakota is so
Right.
good. Is it because the economy's so good?
Yeah, the economy's great in North
Because
Dakota.
of the oil industry?
Yeah, the fracking is just, and also it's relatively inexpensive to live. I mean, it's increased in price recently because of the fracking, driving costs and prices. But when you think about it, is what makes, well, the other thing is North Dakota is an aging population, and we find lower food insecurity rates amongst those who are older. So that's also playing into this. But one thing is that areas with lower food prices also have lower rates of food insecurity, right? Which makes sense, is that the amount of money I have to spend on food depends on my nominal income, but the prices I face also, as you see in areas with lower food prices. So, if you want to make sure that people have enough food to eat, don't put taxes on things. Okay, so this then gives you child food insecurity rates. Okay, so now you're all probably wondering, what's happening in Illinois. So this gives, and I'll come to Chicago momentarily. This gives a picture of what's happening in Illinois. What you see is Illinois really does quite a bit better than the rest of the country. I mean, you have a few areas with high rates, like this here is East St. Louis, which higher rates, and this is getting close to the Delta. So you have some of these areas with higher rates, but in the main, Illinois does pretty well. Now, this does mask though what's going on in Chicago. So what you here is this is from 2012 that so not only do we from Apple Mill Gap, we will do county level estimates, but we'll also do sub-county level estimates. So like in Cook County is telling me Cook County is that you have such and such a rate of food insecurity doesn't tells me something, but not really that much.
Yeah.
And so what you then instead see is you want to look at, so what you see is this is what food insecurity looks like in Chicago, okay? So the areas with, well, as you can see, up to, some areas are up to 45%. So, and you can see is that, across, like, what area would this be called? I don't know. See, this is,
Is it the west side maybe?
yeah, the west side, but all the way to over there. And
That's Berwyn right there.
yeah. Where's Maywood?
Maywood is the way down to the west.
That's Maywood. Okay. That's where my dad grew up. And I always ask my class, anybody from Maywood? Anybody here from Maywood? Okay, nobody. No, nobody there in my class is. My mom grew up in Oak Park. There's lots of people from Oak Park at University of Illinois, but nobody from Maywood. Back then, it was my grandfather was from Norway, and there's a lot of immigrants who came into that area. He didn't work, he worked as an automobile mechanic, but most everybody else there was a big steel packing area, okay? And so what would they do for field trips? They'd go to the slaughterhouse. You can imagine bringing a group of school-age kids today. Well, that's where your dad worked. Yeah, that's where, okay, well, yeah, that would probably, so anyway, but that's what people did. And so they went to so. Okay, so this gives you a picture of it, and so you see that, there's these pockets of really low rates, okay, like the, north side of Chicago is low as, is this like Hyde Park is there, roughly? Okay, so you're gonna have like Hyde Park is gonna be somewhat of an island within that, and so it gives you some sense of what's going on in Chicago. Here's, it just shows the same thing, but it gives you a different way of looking at all that.
And it's just for Cook County, correct?
Right, this is just for Cook County, yeah, just for Cook County, yeah.
Because I'm noticing other Collar County urban areas that I would expect to have higher food insecurity rates just aren't showing up on that.
Right, yeah, this is just for Cook County. Right, so we would imagine that like in
Well, for example, Waukegan is off the map, but Elgin, Aurora, Gilligan are getting
Right, yeah, those are gonna have ours.
pockets.
Right, exactly.
Do you have any evidence on the overlap of food deserts with food insecurity?
Okay, so this is, there's a lot of talk always about food deserts. And so by a food desert, what we mean is areas that are, there's not a lot of food stores within those areas. It's become somewhat controversial in many ways because a lot of people get upset when there are areas called a food desert. They're like, well, actually we have a pretty vibrant economy and things like this. So what we see when we look at food deserts is, first of all, the definition is oftentimes problematic because it depends upon the poverty rate in an area and the distance to the nearest food store. So for example, in Champaign, where I'm from, is that you have these areas where you have high pockets of poverty right next to, like this, our football and basketball coach live in a food desert because they live in a relatively wealthy area right next to a poor area, but it's constituted a food desert. But then we also have to think about what we mean by food deserts. The other part about food deserts is even if somebody lives in a food desert, is they oftentimes are able to get somewhere else to buy food. So for example, if you look at SNAP redemptions, okay, 80% of SNAP redemptions are at large-scale supermarkets like Meijer or Walmart or places like that. Another 15% are at smaller scale supermarkets. So even in areas where they are food deserts, is people are getting to places which are, it may be harder for them to get there. So what we really don't see is much connection between location of food stores and food insecurity. There's two exceptions, but I want to talk about a couple things about that. Is when I think of food deserts, I like to think of them on an individual basis, okay? So if somebody has a serious mobility disability and that prevents them from getting, even if there's a food store, 2 blocks away, they may face real challenge. Or if there's a senior who is isolated in some way.
Capabilities.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so from that standpoint food deserts can actually be, an individual level thing. So that's what I would say. However, is that, location doesn't matter. Food prices do matter. So this is why whenever when Chicago put on that soda tax, a lot of anti-hunger advocates were like, whoa, don't be doing this to It's going to hurt poor people
Yeah.
the most. And this is why there was such an uprising against the soda tax in Chicago, because it hurts poor people.
Yeah.
And so, so that would be an example of something where we see that higher. So it's food prices matter, location not quite as much. Yeah. So, any other questions? Okay. Now what I want to turn to then is a discussion about the determinants of food insecurity. Now when I talk about the determinants, what I mean is controlling for other factors. What are the determinants? Okay, so when I'm going through this is, controlling for, the usual set of other characteristics. So, as I mentioned before, so for example, those with lower incomes are more likely to be food insecure. But also, as I mentioned before, 60% of poor households are food secure. So it's not, of course, completely determined. So, these are some of the things that we see is that, in terms of resources, and this is an interesting one, is that what we see is in households that are facing problems getting enough food for their households, is that there's different responses one could have. And one of the responses we see is that households whose teenagers go to work are less likely to be food insecure. Okay? All else equal. I mean, given all else. So in other words, is that you see teenagers helping to make sure that their families have enough money for food. So that's one example of resources that now, of course, there's lots of issues going on here. So, are people working too much that they're not investing in education or things like this? And so, okay. Are most of the students at Roosevelt from Chicago and the counties, Colorado counties?
Some come from out of state.
About 80%, I think, are from that region, isn't that?
About 80%, okay, yeah. Okay, so household structure has also a big influence on this. But, one of the main determinants of food insecurity is some of the disability in the household, okay? If you look at the most severe category that USDA examines is very low food security amongst households with children, What you find is that most severe category, when they respond, is over half of them have either a parent or a child with a disability. Okay? This is something I don't think we talk nearly enough about in the United States, about how we can make lives better for people with disabilities. And one of the main areas is to help reduce food insecurity rates. It would go a long way to addressing this. And so, but you at least from what I'm hearing, is you don't hear nearly enough discussion about that.
Do you think is it mainly because there's so much financial and time pressure on the household that sucks away its opportunity cost, basically?
Yeah, I that's my sense of it. It hasn't been investigated, surprisingly not enough in terms of like a causal, like what exactly is it? Is it? I would imagine it's a lot of what you're saying. We're controlling for income in these, so they have lower incomes, but even beyond that, they miss that. Yes.
The grandparents in the household, what does that do with it?
Okay, so that's the next one. Let me give a little spiel about this, because this is another interesting thing. Depends upon who's in the house. So what we see is, all else equal, just stepping back for one moment, is there's been a huge increase in the number of multi-generational households in the United States. It went up a lot during the Great Recession and stayed up, but it was also part of a steady increase. And so what you see then is you see a lot of where grandparents raising grandchildren, or grandparents, parents, and grandchildren all in the same household. So studies have looked at this, and what they found is that having a grandparent in the household is helpful, holding everything else equal, okay? And that kind of makes sense. You have one more person to bring in income potentially, one more person to help cook around the house, some of these other things, okay? So it's perhaps, it's advantageous to have a grandparent in the house. Now, the exact opposite, that's if we're looking at if we're looking at children. If we're looking at seniors, though, it's the exact opposite story. Insofar as, if you look at seniors, if they have a grandchild in the household, they're more likely to be food insecure. Part of the reason for this is that for a lot of grandparents this is not something they had planned on doing. They didn't plan on deciding to have the grandchildren come back to the household, so it makes it more difficult for them, so they're more likely to be food insecure. There's also some programmatic issues. So for example, I'm going to be talking a bit later about SNAP. And what you see oftentimes is that de facto, the grandparents are raising a grandchild, but the parents have custody, even though the grandparents are often taking care of the kids, is that grandparents are feeding the grandkids, but their SNAP benefits are not increasing because they don't officially have the children in their homes. So that can be a challenge for them. So we'll try to put over there.
Yeah, I had definitely so far. You said a couple of strides back that the measure of child food insecurity was children living in a home that was food insecure.
I'm sorry,
Sorry, I thought you said that like the measure of child food insecurity was children who live in a home with this food insecure, or did I get that wrong?
so, well, when I was talking about child food insecurity, I was talking about children in the household who are, if they're in a household that's food insecure, they're all defined as being food insecure.
Okay, so
But they may or may not themselves be food insecure.
So how does that definition apply to seniors?
Oh, okay. So there's these 18 questions, and that I talked about. It's right. You came in a little bit later. Yeah. There was 18 questions. 10 are for all households, whether or not children are there. There's another 8 for households for only households with children.
Okay.
So this is why we're able to separate out some.
Yeah,
some
so,
of these issues.
but I'm still trying to go through this sort of, not quite a paradox you've got, but this sort of oppositing with the grandparents becoming less food secure as they take over.
Right, less food secure, right, more food insecure, right, exactly.
So, like, what you're saying about like the SNAP benefits, would it be, with them not technically having custody of the children,
Right.
would it be the same mean that they would be not counted as a household with children, or?
So the way so the way the current population survey defines things is that a grandchild, if the grandchild usually lives with the grandparents, is they would be defined as living in that
Okay.
household. However, the CPS doesn't ask about, do you have custody of these
so-
grandchildren, or do you, or things like that, right?
So we're talking about the same set of households, basically, in both of these cases.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
You got it.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's some things is that, one thing that's, so about race, I talked earlier about American Indians having much higher rates of food insecurity. Actually, the first one is the household head being non-Hispanic black. There's actually a lot of studies which have shown that that's not the case, is that oftentimes there is no, independent of other factors, in an African American household may or may not be more likely to be food insecure. But what's oftentimes seen are that Hispanic Latino households have lower rates of food insecurity than non-Latino families, okay? And that might, at first, is oftentimes that's, because Latinos have, oftentimes have higher poverty rates. But in thinking about it a bit more, it may not be that big of a surprise. So for example, what you see then in the United States is that where Hispanics have tended to move to are areas with vibrant economies, right? They're not moving to Harlan, Kentucky, okay? They're moving to Dallas, they're moving to Houston, and therefore those are where their jobs are. Now, of course, as you all know, there's a lot of heterogeneity amongst Latinos. So for example, there's a large proportion of Latinos living along the Rio Bravo in Texas, and those will then have higher rates of food insecurity. I mean, they've been there for generations. Well, they used to be part of Mexico, but they've been there for generations, and therefore that might not hold. So it doesn't hold in all cases, but in general, we find that Hispanics have lower rates of food insecurity, controlling for other factors.
So the argument you're making is that it's a selection thing.
Exactly.
That we're looking at immigrants, job-seeking immigrants largely.
Right, exactly. And in ways that aren't portrayed with other things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Also moving to areas with lower housing prices,
Right.
Also, I think culturally, you mentioned the cross-generation household. I mean, my culture, that thing, I still live with my grandma lives with me, but
Yeah.
it's like 26, so
Right, no, and that's exactly right. And there's also there's quite a bit of evidence also that there's more of a community feel amongst a lot of Latinos, and therefore that may help protect against food insecurity in some senses. On a previous slide, I talked about the importance of social capital. If people within communities with more social capital, that's beneficial. So. Okay. And these are some of the other things. So, like there was an interesting study. Is it's not clear a priori whether or not having a parent who's incarcerated would lead a family to be more or less likely to be food insecure. On the one hand, the person who's incarcerated may have been a bum and he's out of the house now, and so that's a good thing, right? But on the other hand, is that person is in jail for various reasons, and they were contributing supporters of the household, and they're gone. And so this was a nice study which showed that having a parent incarcerated actually leads to higher rates of food insecurity. So in thinking about, I know that incarceration rates have kind of leveled off, but in thinking about a lot of these issues in terms of, food insecurity make a difference over many different dimensions. So this is an example. There's been some talk about trying to lower rates of incarceration. Well, one advantage to lower rates of incarceration might be a decline in food insecurity rates. This one here, summertime. Summertime's a hard time for kids. A lot of kids enjoy summer if the family has enough money to feed the children. However, if you think about during the school year, children are getting up to 20 meals per week. 10 meals per week.
Yeah.
School breakfast and school lunch every day for over summer, that's gone. So not only does it put pressure on the family to feed the kids over the summer, but it also means that the family where they had all this extra money during the school year is gone. Okay? So it hurts everybody in the family. So this gives you some sense of yes.
Now they're not speaking English in the home, but even though contrary to what you said about like Latino community, they're not usually going to speak English in the home. So what are you referring to in that sense?
Right. So these are things that are like controlling for other factors. So as an example is what we might see is that amongst, if you think about Latino households, some of which do speak English in the home, some of which don't speak English in the home, and is that it could be the case that Latinos where parents do speak English in the home, or at least maybe the kids do, is they're doing better than those who are not. So within that group is you have these differences. Yeah. Okay. Now, so I want to talk a little bit about health outcomes. And with respect to health outcomes is that there's a wide array of different health consequences that are associated with food insecurity. And I really want to emphasize that this is not that people are so malnourished that they can't, people aren't starving in the United States. That's not happening, okay? So I don't mean to say that that's what's happening, but not having enough food is really a challenge. Now, some of these is I talked earlier about lower nutrient intakes. The causality is clear. It goes from food insecurity to lower nutrient. I can't think of a story the other way. This one limitations in activities of daily living is probably something where, it definitely goes from that to food insecurity. So yes, food insecurity rates, food insecurity households have higher rates of limitations in activities of daily living. However, it's probably causing from that way. Other things probably go in different direction. So for example, take the case of depression. A lot of individuals who are depressed may not be as, going out to get food, maybe not something that they want to do as much, or they may not be as, organized to be able to get the food or various other things. So you can imagine that depression would lead to food insecurity. However, is that food insecurity also leads to depression. And I was on a panel in Carson City, Nevada, where I gave a presentation about the usual food insecurities, somewhat akin to this. And it's a relatively dry presentation, and the three persons who came after me were SNAP recipients. And it was heartbreaking, and one of the women said, look, because I had talked about this depression, she goes, it was depressing when I can't feed my children. So you can really see that food insecurity does lead to that.
I was a personal anecdote in In 1987, I was a food stamp caseworker in Indianapolis. I went door to door, interviewing households and maintaining cases. I had 125 households that I looked after each month. But my salary was so low, and I was a father at the time. I'm still a
Yes, you're
father.
still a
Thank you very much. Yeah. Delete. I'm still a father. Thank you. Almost a grandfather. Anyway, I didn't tell you that.
Yeah. Congratulations.
My salary as a food stamp caseworker was so low, once a month I went to the other side of the desk and applied for food stamps, and I got them. I wasn't the only caseworker to get food stamps.
Yeah, no, you'll find a lot of people who are getting SNAP and they're working full time. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not definitely not uncommon. So, as you know, there's lots of talk about healthcare costs, okay? And there's a lot of attention paid to, different determinants of healthcare costs. But one thing that really hasn't been discussed too much is whether or not food insecurity leads to higher healthcare costs, okay? This is a tricky issue to do for the United States, okay? For two reasons. First is there's a selection issue. Could be that those who are more likely to be food insecure are also unable to see a doctor, okay? So if that's the case then you have this paradoxical result that higher rates of food insecurity, those who are food insecure have lower medical care costs, but it's not because they're healthy necessarily, it's just because they can't go to the doctor, they can't afford it. Okay, the other thing is that, which I think is right, is that my healthcare records are protected, okay? A survey can't match up my information to my healthcare records unless I give explicit permission that they can do so. Okay. Now, so we did this. I worked with colleagues in Canada at the University of Toronto, and we, as Canadians, there are different notions of what constitutes privacy. But anyway, we were able to match up food insecurity information with information about their healthcare costs. Okay. So we're able to do that in Canada. But more importantly in this context is that there's not a selection issue, okay? Canada has a universal healthcare system, okay? So if you're poor and need to go see a doctor, you can go see, and there's queuing issues and things like that, but you can go see a doctor, okay? So we did this analysis then in Canada because of this. Now, for those of you who've been to Canada, any Canadians in the room? Okay, but every once in a while you got a Canadian in the room. Canada is basically, those of you who've been there, it's just like the United States, okay? And so, therefore, to do the analysis there, similar to what it would be in the United States. It's not like we're doing the analysis in, Liechtenstein or something. Liechtenstein only has 40,000 people. It's a tiny country. Yeah. 40,000.
40.
Have you been to Liechtenstein?
No.
No. Anybody been to Liechtenstein?
40,000.
Yeah. I think it's completely, yeah. So it's a small country.
More than that to live in Illinois.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so here's what we found in this study, is that in comparison to fully food secure, in other words, households who respond affirmatively to 0 questions, is those who are severely food insecure have food insecurity rates that are 121% higher. Okay? That's, well, again, as Steve always talks about in his own work, it's important to think about what's big. It's like, is 121% big or is it small? Okay? I'm telling you, that's a big number, okay? It really is a large, large impact. So I think that in talking about food insecurity is we think about, and I'm gonna come to momentarily to talk about SNAP. So if we think about SNAP, is getting people on SNAP leads to reductions in food insecurity. So we can think about SNAP as a form of medicine, okay? That lowers healthcare costs in the United States. Okay, so I'll come back to this later. Okay, thank you. Okay, so here's food insecurity and mortality. I'm not going to be talking about that today because I want to get to some other stuff, and we have 25 minutes left. Okay, so I'd like to get to that. Okay, so I have to talk about this. I want to talk about food assistance programs, and I want to first talk about this. You oftentimes hear people talk about a right to food. Okay, like we have what do you call them? Negative rights, like the right to vote is a negative right, and you have positive rights, and people oftentimes talk about positive right of a right to food. Okay. Some countries have implemented a right to food, but is if you have a right but you can't give it to people, I don't know what in a meaningful sense that means. So as an example, India in their constitution has a right to food. However, if you look at the proportion of people in India alone that are malnourished, it far exceeds all of Africa. In other words, is that India is not able to guarantee a right to food, but they still have it in their constitution. So some countries do have this right to food. Now, in the United States, we don't have a right to food. There's no such thing in our constitution or anything else. However, de facto, we do have we implemented legally is we do have a right to food in the United States, okay? And that's SNAP, okay? So what SNAP does is it gives every low-income person in the country enough resources to purchase a low-cost food basket, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that all those households are going to be food secure, and I'm going to talk about that later, but we really have a well-defined right to food, and SNAP is an entitlement program, okay? In the sense that whoever needs SNAP benefits is that the program will expand to include everybody. So this to me is an exciting thing. I mean, the U.S. always gets a lot of criticism for different stuff we do, but we should get credit for that we have a really amazing program, SNAP. And I'm going to be, I try to be as objective as possible. I'm a huge fan of SNAP, really, and it's going to come out in this. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of assistance programs. Like I think WIC is overrated and some of these other ones, but I love SNAP, and I'll talk a little bit about that.
We talked about
Yeah, we talked about this, yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, that's fine. But is that the primary goal of SNAP, I'm going to come back to this again, is to alleviate hunger. So in the United States, there were serious problems with hunger. There were problems of stunting, there's problems of wasting. As recently as like 60 years ago in parts of Appalachia, parts of the Mississippi Delta, I mean, you saw pictures of children, what today we would think of as living in a low-income country, or for that matter, like the picture that was on the advertisement for this. I mean, serious issues of food insecurity and hunger in our country. We implemented SNAP then called the Food Stamp Program, in order to address this issue. Okay? SNAP is oftentimes called to do a lot of other things. Okay? But what I always think about is whenever we implement a policy, we should not ask about, is a program successful at doing X, Y, or Z? We can ask those questions. But what you have to mainly ask about is, does it do what it set out to do? That's what we should ask of a program. It said it's going to do this, does it do it? Okay. Okay, the way SNAP works is, again, yes?
So if we have this very program, then why do we have like food insecurity?
Right. So, okay. So right. To some extent is the way we've defined the right to food is if somebody's low income and they're eligible for SNAP, they can then go on to the program. About a quarter to 35% of the people who are food insecure in the United States are not eligible for SNAP. So they're not even on that program. So this comes down, and this is a discussion oftentimes is held within respect to assistance programs, is what is our obligation to a family making $70,000 a year that's food insecure? Do we have the responsibility as a society for a family of that level? I mean, some would say, well, it's not. I don't know what it is. We can have philosophical discussion, or somebody live in Chicago. It's expensive to live here. Somebody make $110,000. What do we, So that's the first part of that. The second part of it is that, as I'll come to in a little while, is that even though we're giving people SNAP, which I think is great, is that we're not giving a lot of them enough SNAP benefits. So a lot of SNAP recipients, despite having this, are not food secure. A third reason is that despite SNAP being this huge help to people, it's not automatic to enroll in SNAP. People have to, like Steve was saying, you have to go in and apply for it, okay? So if you have to go in and apply for it, there's a lot of people who are low income, despite the fact that they have the right to SNAP benefits. They literally have the right to go in and get this, but they have to do that to get it. So for those three reasons. So the way it works is that the USDA issues food stamps on a card. So like in Illinois, you'll see on stores oftentimes, link accepted here. That means that if I'm a link recipient, if I'm a SNAP recipient, I can go in there with a link card and swipe that to get food. And it can be used in retail food outlets, and virtually all retail food outlets above a certain size accept it. You'll even see a lot of convenience stores and things like that. It's pretty widespread in order to be used. And when you use them, is one of the strengths. I think it's a strength. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. Is people have the freedom to choose whatever kind of foods they want to choose. Okay, but it has to be food items. So you can't purchase, paper towels or something, or
Not prepared food either.
and not prepared food. Right. So like you can't buy a rotisserie chicken.
Right.
That's right. Right, and no, so even though technically alcohol is a food, is that you can't purchase alcohol with it, okay, nor can you purchase tobacco with it, but yeah. Okay. So, now, this is per month. The maximum benefit level for a family of 4 is $700, roughly $700 per month for a family of 4. In other words, families of 4 are getting up to $8,400 a year. Now, I'm going to come to this later. I think we should be giving people more money. But this is not a stingy program, okay? I mean, at the maximum, people are getting a fair amount of money of this. And even if you think about the average benefit level is $300 for a family of 4. You don't hear sirens coming up and down.
We do normally.
You do it because I haven't heard
It's been
anything.
remarkably quiet tonight.
Yes. So I was giving a lecture in Brussels, and they have the same sirens in Brussels as they do in France.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and if you could picture the way that sounds. So I was listening to it. I told the audience. I said,
responding to you.
right, yeah, is that? See, I felt like an old man here. Is that there's a song called "Street Fighting Man" by the Rolling Stones. Okay. And Keith Richards was the guitarist for this, and he kept on trying to get that sound of a Paris police car into the song. So if you listen to the start of Street Fighting Man, also listen to a siren, a Paris siren. So it's really, yeah. So, but so many people in the audience, they have heard of the Rolling Stones, but they hadn't heard the song Street Fighting Man, which is crazy. I mean, that's a well-known. How many of you have not heard Street Fighting Man? Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's what I was kind of like when I was telling the story there, is people looked at me like, why is he telling us about this? just like all of you are saying, why is he talking about this song that we've never heard? It's really a good song. In my opinion, the best Rolling Stones album is Beggar's Banquet, and that's off Beggar's Banquet. So I would encourage you to listen to that when you go home tonight. Okay. So this then is the size of the program. So not only are we generous with giving people a lot of money, it also serves, I should update my slides. It's now about 42 million people, and the total cost is about $72 billion a year. Okay? We're giving people, this is a big program. 60% of the USDA, people think about USDA as being a farm program. USDA is a food assistance program. So, okay. Now, I'm not going to go over the eligibility criteria to say that people get benefits to this are relatively poor and they don't have a lot of assets. So this is what SNAP participants and expenditures looks like. A lot of people look at this figure. Let's just concentrate on the blue, on the red line, the number of SNAP participants. Okay. A lot of people look at this figure. The number of SNAP participants is on the left. The axis is on the left side. So what we see is starting in about 2005, there was a steady increase. Okay. Leading up to this, and then during the Great Recession, we had this huge increase in the number of SNAP recipients. On the one hand, this is bad. The people had to go on to SNAP. On the other hand, this is the mark of a successful program. When people were in need, they were able to turn to this program. I think that's a good thing. And there's always a lot of talk like, this is bad, look what's happening. Well, yeah, yes, it is bad, look what's happening. On the other hand, look how great this is that we have a program that can step up into this. So it started to decline a little bit more recently, but it still remains quite high. For those of you who are interested in this, Steve's brother has a nice paper in a book that he and I and then Tim Speed and Judy Bartfeld called SNAP Matters, 50 years of the food stamp program, looking on Stanford University Press. Jim has a nice paper in that about this issue. So anyway, it's controversial. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this because I really want to get to some other stuff. SNAP is you have to carefully address selection and measurement area issues, and we can have a long discussion about that if we want to, but I just want to get to the main point. SNAP participants, in comparison to eligible non-participants, are 20% less likely to be food insecure, okay? You're not going to find many government programs that show that level of success, okay? It's set out to alleviate food insecurity, and it's achieved that. This is a big number, 20%. It's a large, really a clear sign this has been a successful program. So, coming back to this thing is, even though food insecurity rates rose over this time period, it would have been much, much worse had SNAP not been there to increase. Okay.
Did the rates change during the recession, or there's, because the expenditures per capita is going up
Right.
there, so there's the issue of how much is it loss in family income and or assets versus, in fact, could be gain in assets if you had to keep your car, right?
Right.
And how much of it is about change in the schedule?
So, there's two things going on, is that we know, Steve is alluding to, is as people's income falls, the amount of benefits they get increases. And therefore, you're going to have more people say, I'm going to go on the program now. And you also have more people who are eligible. So there's a mechanistic, it's mainly mechanistic, is that people get, rather than changes in behavior to get them. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about, so I give presentations to, I don't do this as much anymore, but I used to give a lot of presentations to ag groups, okay? They love a lot of what I had to say because I would give presentations and I talk, farmers love GMOs, I'm a pro-GMO guy. They're not big fans of SNAP, so I have to give presentations to them, and then they always raise some of these issues. I also give presentations to nutritionists and public health people, and they can't stand me because is that I talk a lot about how great SNAP is because it gives people the freedom of choice to make choices about what they want to purchase. A lot of public health people don't like to give people choices.
No.
They want to dictate what people can and can't do with their life. So therefore, I'll tell you some funny stories later about, well, I won't have time to tell this. They may or may not be funny. Some people might think they're sad, but I'll tell you one quickly right now. I was giving a presentation for the Institutes of Medicine panel on WIC, and I was talking about how, one of the challenges with WIC is that you have really high participation rates because infant formula is widely used, but then as kids get older, you have really low rates of participation. And I said to the group from WIC, I said, y'all can learn a lot from SNAP by giving people a little more flexibility. So for example, is like the person before me was talking about how like in the Rio Bravo area, you have really low rates of participation amongst Mexican Americans because you can only use WIC to buy brown rice. In the main is who wants to eat brown rice? But at any rate, is that at least in these communities, is people, why don't I want brown rice? Who wants it? And the other thing is, I was reading something interesting today. There's really the advantages. It's not clear if brown rice is better than white rice. So for those of us who like real rice, white rice, instead of that, sort of stuff that you can't really enjoy. But at any rate, we're doing the right things. But the point being is, and I was saying, maybe SNAP could be a bit more. And so I said, my whole point of this was WIC could learn a lot from SNAP.
Yeah.
It did not go well. The person speaking after me, she goes, I really wish I had the last 30 minutes of my life back. That was the last 30 minutes. Was my presentation. so that's what oftentimes the reaction that I get when I give presentations. But so today is I want to talk against some of the things that people say negatively about SNAP. Okay? The first thing is, and some of these will be things ag groups say, other things will be things that the public health people say. The first thing is there's this notion that people on SNAP are lazy in some sense. And I gotta tell people, yeah, there's lots of people who are lazy on SNAP, and there's lots of people not on SNAP like myself who are lazy. In other words, but the program itself does not make people quote unquote lazy. And here's the reason why, is that there's no what we call cliff effects, okay? So with a lot of programs, Medicaid is in some ways a poorly designed program. Because if I make one more dollar than the cutoff, I lose all my Medicaid benefits. Okay? Would I work more hours if I can lose all my Of course not. Somebody would be foolish to work more or get a higher paying job. That's not the case with SNAP though. For each additional dollar somebody makes, they lose roughly 24 cents in benefits. So as you get closer and closer to the eligibility threshold, your benefit levels go down. There's really not a disincentive in SNAP to be on SNAP. And in fact, if we do take this seriously, the main thing we should do is make the tax less. In other words, if for each additional dollar I make is, if I'm earning that income, is my SNAP benefits don't go down by 24 cents. It goes down by 15 cents. Yeah. We're having a lot of discussions right now about taxes, right? Yeah. Different changes in taxes. Let's talk about this for low-income households and how SNAP can be better designed. So, at any rate, is that it's a myth that SNAP leads people to work less. Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't have a work disincentive built.
Exactly. Exactly. Other programs do, and these other programs, I don't know why they're designed that way. They should design them better, but they should look to SNAP. If Medicaid wants to know how to do things better, they should look to SNAP.
That was 55 years of AFDC. It was terrible.
Right, exactly. It was terrible. AFDC was terrible. Yeah. Basically, who would work on those programs? And there's elements currently in SSI that are the same thing. So it's a problem. So the other thing is if I could, the number of times people tell me about fraud and SNAP, and it always boggles me. I'm like, and the first thing I feel like saying is this is an amazing program. If there's a little bit of fraud, I don't care. Yeah. I genuinely don't care. It's helping out tens of millions of Americans. If some people are engaging in fraud, okay, but people talk about it all the time. So the first thing is that this is something where if people would redeem, they would go to a small scale grocery store and say, here's $40 in SNAP benefits. The cashier will give $20 back in cash, and the store will pretend like they sold $40 worth of food. Okay, that was one type of fraud. Today, this is next to impossible to do because now we have the EBT system. It's a little bit easier with somebody had coupons and stuff. But now and plus, most all SNAP benefits are at reputable retailers. Like 1/3 of all SNAP benefits are redeemed at Walmart. I can assure you Walmart's not running a scam whereby they're doing this, okay? So in other words, you can't go into a Jewel or an Osco. Is it Jewel to Osco together? Jewel?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And so you can't do that here. So anyway, it's not happening. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second type of fraud that people always talk about, I really don't see it as a problem. If I have extra SNAP benefits and I have to pay my rent, let me sell it to somebody who needs some more food. Nobody's being hurt by this. It's illegal though, so I have to talk about this. Yeah. It was a lot easier when we had stamps, I could sell them to somebody else, 60 cents on the dollar or whatever. They're better off because they have more money for food. I'm better off because I have money for rent. But now today is that we have these cards, if I want to sell somebody my SNAP benefits, I have to give them my card, I have to give them my PIN number, and I hope that they can bring it back to me. Yeah. So it's a lot harder today. Yeah. I'm going to skip over this air raid stuff. But the one thing I will say is that overall, if you look at any metric of fraud at SNAP, it's a model program. The IRS could learn a lot. The extent of fraud in the IRS is so much higher than it is in SNAP. That the people there should sit down with some of these people at USDA and say, what are you guys doing? And they can talk to them. Okay.
They should sit down with me. My supervisor said I had a 0 error rate when I was a case.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Very proud of that, as you can tell.
Yeah.
30 years later.
Yeah, 30 years later. Had a big sign, 0 above him.
Yeah. The dean here?
Yeah. This is the other problem that I have with a lot of people with SNAP is there's all these people who say that SNAP leads to increases in obesity. Whenever people say that, I was like, what are you talking about? Yeah. Because it's a weird thing in the following sense is that usually we think about, and we see this all the time, if you look at as people's incomes increase, their probabilities of being obese fall, right? And also we don't think that just because you give people more money, they get bigger and bigger. Like nobody says Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, they must be 15,000 pounds because they're eating so much. Nobody talks about giving money to other people that it's going to make them overweight. Yeah. Okay, when I got a pay raise when I worked for USDA, The people that go on, Gundersen's put on weight, I think it's because he got that pay raise. Nobody says that sort of stuff. However, with low-income households, there's this sense then that if we give them more money to purchase food, it'll make them more likely to be obese. I'm like, this is just a stupid argument. This is what the public health.
Don't you think that the media kind of supports that idea, because not too long ago in the news on Chicago, they're talking about how a high percentage of SNAP benefits go to buying or purchasing soda or sugar goods.
Right. That's true. Okay? Everybody's budget spends a lot of money on it.
Yeah.
So back to this notion about, is it a problem with SNAP? Or is it a problem that other people, if you look at the consumption bundles of those on SNAP compared to those who are eligible but also on SNAP, it's roughly the same. Okay, yes, they're not, the average amount of types of food purchased among SNAP recipients are not, like they are in, I don't know, Evans, or some fancy area. So in other words, you're not gonna find that. On the other hand is that it's not, and plus it's not because they're getting SNAP. You have to think about what would have happened if you took away SNAP from them, okay? There's a lot of evidence that people will try to purchase energy-dense foods.
Yeah.
Okay, and one way to purchase energy-dense foods is it's cheaper. Okay, SNAP means I can move away from some of this. So, yeah. And you always hear the story about when I was in this checkout line the other day, the person in front of me was buying X, Y, and Z, and I'm always like, boy, that's why you're rather, and then it comes up a little bit later, like, and then they drove off in a Range Rover. I'm like, how do you care so much about what this person is? But they always say this, and it always drives me nuts. I suppose my response is the person in front of me is usually like, fantastic, I'm happy to live in a country where this person is getting enough food.
Yeah. And
that's my response. I'm like, great, glad you're not lucky. Anyway, but people say this all the time, that leads to increases in obesity, and what we find is that there's no impacts of SNAP on obesity, and there's actually some evidence that leads to reductions in obesity. Okay, so for those who keep on talking about
better
SNAP,
food choices.
better for you, you have more opportunities.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what we see in other segments of the population. It bothers me to no end when people in our society treat low-income households differently than they do other parts of our society. I think it's really, really a problem. And this is not any political thing. You have the public health people doing this, talking about, you should be eating this, or then you have the people on the right who are like, you're lazy and these things. People think we have to stop talking. Anyway, yeah, so.
Yeah.
Well, it also illustrates the need to get beyond anecdotal observation and actually look at comprehensive quantitative data.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask you about, which is kind of raised by food choices, is it still the case that in Illinois now SNAP users can get double the face value when they buy
farmers markets?
at farmers markets? Yeah. Which is a good thing. That's a good thing where so it's a positive incentive to make a healthy choice.
Right. So I agree. I'm a big fan of incentives like that. I'd be an even bigger fan of them if you could use them anywhere. That would be my only complaint, because
Hard to get to farmers.
Farmers markets.
For food, for certain foods, or for.
Oh, in other words, is they have this thing where if I go to a farmer's market, I can get twice as many apples for the same price,
Right.
or whatever. My preference would be is that they go to Walmart or Jewel Osco or wherever, they would also get twice as much apples.
Healthy food regardless of the purveyor.
Regardless of that, okay?
So what if you bought soda at a farmer's market?
Yeah, no, that's right. I don't know how that works.
With tamarind.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think it's
With real sugar.
yeah. So it was an interesting thing where I think that's I do think like programs like that are great, just so long as they don't cut back on it and say, well, we're going to do this, but we're going to cut back on the average benefit levels.
Right.
I want to be respectful of people's times, because I did say 5:45. There's a few other things I was going to talk about, but this is the main thing I wanted to get around to.
Gary, do we have 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes, sure.
5 more? Okay, is that okay with everybody here? I'll talk real fast about it. I want to talk about then, I'm going to skip over this stuff. There's some threats to SNAP. Okay? The first threat is block grants. They've talked, currently, as I mentioned before, SNAP is an entitlement program. Whenever bad times hit, program expands, When good times hit, program contracts. Wonderful. That's what the program does. Okay, it's one of our countercyclical programs.
Functional finance.
Yeah, and with block grants, so as they proposed, is that to give to each state a certain amount of money that they can spend however they want. And at the surface, it's like, oh, we'll give states more flexibility. Anytime you block grant a program, what ends up happening though is that during economic downturns, Congress never comes back and says, oh, let's increase benefits. That never happens. So once you lose the entitlement status of SNAP, so this is something where hopefully it's not going to be moving forward, and there seems to be less interest in this. But there's other sets of restrictions. For all who participates, as I mentioned before, SNAP is an anti-hunger program. Okay, it's not a program designed to get people off of drugs. It's not a program designed to make people work. It's an anti-hunger program. And therefore, like in terms of the drug testing, is, the argument goes if people test positive for drugs is then that they will not be able to get the benefits. Well, people that are using drugs, we should be trying to help them out, but also is that they're part of a family. You take away those benefits, it's going to hurt a lot of other people. Yeah. So that's just, and plus, I would just, so like I say a lot of stupid stuff when I talk to farmers, and this is something I said this one time. This was some guy in the room from the ag industry raised up his hand and said, well, don't you think they should be starting to test people coming in for benefits? And this is something I never should have said. I said, well, do they test farmers for crop insurance? That did not go over. They looked at me like I was just saying the most bizarre thing in the world. And so, so they did not. That was not something. I said, of course. But the point about this was it would discourage people. In fact, I can guarantee you, if somebody told me I had to do something, I had to get a drug test, it's just not worth it. It'll discourage
What's
people.
a better way to work up your appetite than to smoke a split? They go together.
Yeah. Nevertheless,
Should be mandatory.
That's not usually the argument that's given. Okay. The other thing is about this is that there's also this other notion that we should restrict what people purchase. Okay. Currently, SNAP gives poor households the dignity to make whatever choices they feel are best for their families. It's really hard to be poor in the United States. It's even harder when the government starts telling you what you can and can't do. Yeah. So there's long time, Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, he was really the spearhead of this whole thing of like restricting what people can and can't purchase with SNAP. Over time, it's become this crazy. It started out as a public health people saying, oh, we should tell people what they can and can't eat. And then what ended up happening is that those on the right said, well, I know full well if we start restricting what people eat, people aren't going to be on the program, so it'll save us money. So it's now become Republicans, because in the main, Republicans and public health people don't have much in common, except over wanting this. So I want to talk about what happens if we restrict SNAP benefits. It's increase in stigma, okay? Currently, when I go through the supermarket line, if I'm using my SNAP benefits, and then I use this, is that I have a pretty good idea of what's eligible and what's not eligible. I know full well that those paper towels aren't, but this. In cases where they start to say, this is eligible, this is not eligible, that's gonna be hard for people to know. So for example, some of these proposals have been things like, like this crazy thing that they proposed in Minnesota where some candies, except candies with wheat, aren't eligible. And so therefore, can you imagine being in line and saying, nope, that's not SNAP eligible? It'd be embarrassing, to be in line, be told by the, something other. Or when they talk about banning sugar-sweetened beverages. Sugar-sweetened beverages, people think of soda, yes, but there's also Gatorade, Lipton iced tea. You not believe the number of things that are not considered. So it's stigma. The second thing is, it's patronizing. It's incredibly patronizing to tell a low-income household, here's what you can purchase. Every year I get my mortgage tax deduction, which is obscene. I get more in my mortgage tax deduction than the maximum SNAP benefit for a family of five. That's but I'm not going to talk about why the mortgage tax deduction is bad. But my point being is that the government would never dare to tell me how I can and can't spend my mortgage tax deduction. Right. Or when I work for USDA, they would never tell me how I can spend. I'm getting money from the government. Yeah. They couldn't tell me. So anyway, I can talk a little more about how it's going to increase food prices and reductions in SNAP outlets. So what this means then is that there's going to be an increase in food insecurity. Those who are pro-restrictions are pro-hunger. There's going to be no change in obesity. It already is not a problem, as I mentioned before, but people will leave the program. This is something, SNAP is not like WIC. People always say, well, shouldn't we make SNAP like WIC? Okay, I say no, in part because participation rates are really low amongst as children get aging and they decide they don't like brown rice, like who does? And so then you get that. But the other thing is it's not like WIC is designed for those 4, 3, 2, and it's really easy to say a 4-year-old should be eating this. How do you tell a household with a 62-year-old, a 37-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 2-year-old what they should and shouldn't be purchasing? It'd be an absolute mess.
Yeah.
The final thing is, and I hate, is that there's too much in our society of, this is not something just for the United States, a lot of other countries, too much experimenting on poor people.
Thank you.
And then saying things like, everybody always says, oh, we don't want to really implement this, we just want to see if it works. I'm like, don't do this to, it's hard enough to be pointing at, and I really is really bad when people say, oh, we'll just try this out on them, in ways that we would never do to other income groups.
Or to
So,
their own children.
right, or their own children, right, yeah. And so anyway, I'm sorry to take up your extra time. I really do apologize. But I really thank all of you for coming to this. I really do.
so much.
And thank you again. Okay.